Well, hello again. This is Jeremy Galbreath with the School of Management at Curtin University. And this is going to be my third and final video in a series on innovation in times of crisis. And today, I wanted to simply cut to the chase. What I want to talk about today is in the past, we've looked at some concepts around how we define, conceptualize innovation. We've talked about how companies are innovating, how governments are innovating in times of this crisis or the current climate with coronavirus. And the reality is that a lot of times in times of crisis, that creates opportunity for innovation. And unfortunately, we are in this circumstance, but the reality is that does drive innovation. But what I want to really focus on and think about today is we need to continually think about innovation, not just in times of crisis. If we're going to be better at creating value for our customers and for our clients, and quite frankly, for societal welfare, we need to be better innovators. And so what I want to talk today with you about is more of looking at, I guess, what I would call a cycle or a circle of innovation, a framework, a model for how we can do better at being innovative, whether or not it's in a time of crisis or after this time of crisis, 6 months, 8 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the road. The ultimate aim here is we want to be better at being innovative. And so what I'm going to talk about today is very simply, I've got a couple of slides I want to talk you through and explain. And as somebody who has been teaching about innovation for a number of years, I do my own research in the innovation space, but the reality is to inform myself, I also draw on the literature. I also look at what others are doing with respect to innovation and with respect to research on innovation. And today I'm going to talk about a couple of studies from a company called McKinsey and Company. Now, last time I would have referenced them, I mentioned them. The reality is McKinsey is one of the oldest and perhaps arguably the most famous strategy consulting firm in the world. And this company has a long history of studying innovation. And quite frankly, because of who they are positioned with and the number of clients they have around the world, they have conducted a lot of really interesting innovation studies. And I'm going to highlight just a couple of those for you today. So let me go ahead and bring up those slides. And the first one that I want to focus on is one that looks at a model around innovation, but factors that determine what makes companies more successful with respect to innovation. So simply what this graphic is showing here, in this particular study, McKinsey concluded that there are essentially 8 factors that help companies be more successful at innovating. And what this chart is suggesting is a relationship between the number of factors that a company masters or becomes very proficient in and their economic profit or their economic performance. And what this result suggests, or what this chart suggests, is that as companies number more and more of those factors, master more and more of those factors, as that number increases, economic performance also increases. And if you're essentially only mastering 1 or 2 factors, economic performance isn't quite as good. So if you're an organization that the bottom line is critical, is important, in most companies in the private sector, that's the case. The reality is we need to become proficient at more of these factors to drive better profitability. Now, if you're in a government agency, if you're in higher education, perhaps the economic bottom line isn't quite as emphasized. But I think the point here simply is that to become better at innovating, we need to look at a framework and a model for how we go about doing that. And I think this McKinsey framework is a good one to follow. So let me go ahead and jump into that. It's what I'll call the cycle of innovation, the circle of innovation. It's a framework, it's a model. What I want to walk you through now is what are those essential elements or factors of that innovation model. And the first one is simply aspire or aspiration. The reality is, again, doesn't really matter what sector you are in. If we're going to get better at innovation, whether it's during this time of crisis or it's after this time of crisis, we have to have a vision, a mission, a purpose, however you want to frame that, around innovation. And it's more than just that. We need to be able to think about how do we quantify innovation throughout the organization. In other words, don't just talk about it. Don't just try to inspire employees to be more innovative. Quantify how you are going to get there. Have some targets. Have some KPIs. Quantify it. Be objective about how you're going to be more innovative. And of course, we would expect at this level that top executives, managing directors, these would be the ones who would be inspiring employees. But my view is, yes, that is needed, that is important, but we also need to think about middle managers, those who are probably closer to the coalface than top executives, certainly when it comes to the day-to-day reality of innovating. They too need to inspire employees. They need to inspire each other. So let's have a vision and a purpose or a mission around being more innovative and quantify that and what that looks like for the organization. The next one down is what McKinsey calls choose. And when we think about choice, the reality is we have limited time, we have limited resources, we have limited attention. And so the point here is that we need to think about which innovations are most critical. Again, we talked about a framework, a couple of topologies with respect to how can we conceptualize innovation or define it. And in any given particular case, that may look different depending on the sector, depending on the organization. What we need to think about, though, is yes, we might have many options to innovate, and maybe in the current climate, in this crisis climate, there are a lot of number of innovations that might be relevant to your particular organization. But the reality is, more than likely, you can't achieve or you can't innovate around all of those things. So we need to be very clear, strategic about the choices that we make. Are the innovations that we're thinking about, the options that maybe we've uncovered, how does that align to the organization? How does that align to organizational resources and where there is a good fit? Those are the innovations that we should be moving forward with. Yes, of course, we want to think about having perhaps more than one, some kind of a portfolio, but ultimately we have to put a stake in the ground. We have to move forward by choosing certain innovations. And what that likely means is choosing certain innovations over others, those that are most relevant, those that are most aligned with your organization, with the resources, with the capacity that you have to be effective around those choices. The next one is what is called discover. So this is probably just simply going back to classic market research. What do your customers want? What do they need? What do your clients want? What do they need? I think Steve Jobs used to say is most customers actually don't know what they want, so I'm going to tell them what they want. There's probably a little bit of truth in that, but the reality is if we're going to get better at innovating, we need to understand our customers. It's classic kind of target market segmentation. Who are your customers and what do they value? So we need to build a level of intelligence around the customer, around the client. And by the way, we need to distribute that intelligence. We need to manage that effectively throughout the organization. So this is where maybe things like knowledge management systems, kind of breaking down functional silos where we're sharing, we're discussing the customer, we're discussing the client, so that everybody understands who they are, first of all, and what do they value. That should form the basis of being able to come up with some innovative ideas around whether it's a product, a process, a service, maybe some kind of business model transformation. Discover your customers, who they are, what they want, what they value. That's important. Next one is what McKinsey from the study calls evolve. I would have mentioned this last time. Again, I still think a lot of people, and in my own experience, a lot of people tend to associate innovation with a product. And the reality is nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, there are product innovations. We see product innovations all the time. But the reality is not every company, not every organization is a product-based organization or manufactures a product. Many organizations rely much more heavily on services, on processes. And so we need to think about innovation in the context of processes, in the context of services, and as I would have mentioned last time as well, probably more and more importantly is the business model. And I would have said this last time, I'm sorry if I repeat it again, but I think it's an important point to make is when we look at higher education, for example, I think the reality is when we come out of this current crisis, we may very well see some significant business model transformations going on in that particular sector. It may be in your sector, the same thing may be occurring. It may be a business model transformation. We need to evolve our thinking beyond just innovation as a product. It is much, much more than that. And we have to be very attuned to who we are in our own organizations, what the sector is that you operate in, and what is relevant to you with respect to the type of innovation. And that's where the previous session or the previous video, I talked much more about that topology. Apply that topology to your own organization and evolve the thinking. Okay, the next factor is what is called accelerate. And it probably goes back to the idea of what I call pipeline management. So as an academic, as somebody who has to conduct research and publish articles, that is just part and parcel with being an academic. That is part and parcel of being in the higher education sector. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that if I'm going to do well at publishing, I need a substantial pipeline because the lead times to publish research are getting longer and longer and longer. And so if you're going to publish anything, you need a very, very strong research pipeline. That might be that I've got 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 articles under review. It may mean that I've got 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 articles that I'm writing. It may be that I've got 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 research projects where I'm just collecting data. I'm kind of in the very, very early stages. So with respect to this factor, in terms of accelerate, what you want to do is you want to ensure that you have a reasonably good innovation pipeline and that you're ensuring that that pipeline is moving forward. It's progressing, it's accelerating. You're not just sitting on 50 great ideas that are doing nothing. You're always working towards moving those innovative ideas through the pipeline, accelerating them through, bringing them to market, refining the process, crafting, creating a new service that you can offer clients, and then getting that out there into the marketplace and testing it and refining it. That's the point here in terms of accelerate. Manage an innovation pipeline well. Next one is called scale. And again, it goes back to, and it probably depends on the type of sector, the type of organization that you work for but in some cases, maybe not all cases, but in some cases, you may have multiple market segments that you're dealing with. I mean, I think of higher education because, again, that's my most recent work experience, is we think about undergraduates. That tends to be a very, very large and broad market segment. Then we start to narrow that down as we start thinking about postgraduate students or doctoral students. Then those market segments become much, much smaller. So I think what the research from McKinsey is suggesting here is that you need to think about how do I scale my innovations appropriately. If it's for the undergraduate market where you may have thousands of customers or clients, you may need to be operating at a much larger scale. If you have another customer segment where you might only have 100 or 500, then perhaps the scale needs to look differently. It needs to scale differently. But I think what McKinsey is suggesting here is that be prepared to manage and scale appropriately depending on your market segments. Okay, next one is called extend. So when we think about innovation, again, in the past, certainly in my own experience, again, from listening to the first video that I recorded, I come from the private sector. I worked for AT&T and Lucent Technologies back in the States for many, 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 many years in the high technology sector before I kind of converted my career path into academia. And I've been doing this for the past 15 or so odd years. Is that in my day, when I was working in private sector, innovation was pretty much within the confines of the walls of our organization. Today, it's much more about open innovation. That is, innovation can come from anywhere and virtually anybody. So smart organizations, smart companies, smart government agencies, smart institutions of higher education are collaborating more regularly for external sources of innovation. So again, coming from the United States, as I pointed out in the first clip, there was a very, very strong relationship between higher education and the private sector that drove a lot of innovation. Now, when I moved to Australia, I didn't quite see that type of culture. Maybe that will happen in the future, I don't know. But I think what we need to be very, very aware of is that regardless of the sector and the type of organization that you work for, is don't discount collaboration or collaborative opportunities to drive new innovation. We must look outside the organization, because the reality is if we become too insular, then so will our innovations. And we need to be open to new ideas. And that may come from another company in the private sector. That may come through more collaborative efforts with respect to the private sector and higher education. It may come from government agencies more regularly collaborating with the private sector and or higher education. Whatever form that takes is just to be aware that to be more innovative, to be more effective at innovation, don't discount ideas, opportunities from external sources. Okay, the last one is called Mobilize. And I think this is actually a pretty vital factor when it comes to how do we think about getting better and innovative. And this is really all about human capital. At the end of the day, it's people. It's the human capital of your organization. That's where innovation comes from. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we mobilize that human capital. So I think about this, and I tend to relate this with respect to HRM practices. So, we can think about how do we upskill, reskill, upskill employees to be more innovative. Well, maybe that becomes part of an HR policy or an HR strategy. We're going to engage our employees, send them to training, for example, in design thinking, or more innovation-related types of courses and opportunities. Because the reality is we need employees who understand what innovation is, who understand how to undertake innovative projects, who understand how to manage the innovation process, whether they're executives or they're middle-level managers or they're people on the front line. I think those organizations and those companies that can better engage their employees effectively in this innovation space, according to the McKinsey research, again, tend to perform better. So we need to permeate the organization, call it culture if you want to. We need a culture of innovation, and we need to mobilize and equip and engage our employees to be more effective at innovation, because innovation doesn't just come from the research and development department. Again, I think that's another myth that many companies might have an R&D department, and they're the ones who are responsible for innovation. Well, that's just, in the current environment, that is simply not true. We need to ensure that all of our employees are mobilized to engage in innovation. And that sort of goes back to the first factor when we talk about Aspire. How do you incent your employees to be more innovative? How do you reward your employees to be more innovative? So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be about a financial incentive or reward. It could be something else. Just thinking off the top of my head, I don't know, maybe a week holiday in Margaret River, whatever the case might be. Think about how we can incent and reward employees at all levels to be more innovative, but we need to equip them and we need to mobilize them with respect to that task. So when we think about ultimately times of crisis don't last forever. It will end, whether it's this coronavirus or other past events that have happened, whether it's on a national level or on a global scale. These events do end, and we have to move on. If we're going to get better at innovation, whether we can talk about it in the current environment, today, next week, a month from now, or 5 years from now, I think this is a good framework and a good model that will help steer us in that direction. Because again, it's research-based, it's evidence-based, and it suggests that companies that are mastering or are much more effective at each one of these in a holistic way tend to do better at innovation and tend to deliver better performance. And of course, ultimately, that's what we would hope for with respect to innovation. So, look, I just wanted to say that this is the third and final part of this series on innovation in times of crisis. And I hope that I've given you a few ideas around how we can perhaps more effectively think about innovation, not just in the crisis, in the moment, but also beyond that, because really we all want to be better in innovation, because guess what? In the end, society benefits. In the end, our companies benefit. In the end, our clients benefit. In the end, our customers benefit from innovation efforts. And that's, we need more of that, not just today, but tomorrow. And again, as I mentioned last time, I've just got my email address up again. By all means, for those of you who would like to contact me further to have maybe further conversation, further discussion, points of clarification, I am happy to field those questions and speak to you personally. So with that being said, thank you for your time listening to these video clips. I think this one was much shorter than the last one, and I think these days our attention spans are pretty tight and low. So I wanted to try to keep this as tight as I could, and I hope that I've accomplished that today. So again, I just want to say I hope everyone is doing well. Please take care of yourselves. I look forward to perhaps further engaging with some of you around how can we think about innovation and how can we get better at innovating. So take care, everybody, and maybe I'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Cheers.